In 1971, 24-year-old Nora Calloway sat in a suffocating wood-paneled law office in the heart of the Oregon Valley, listening to the final reading of her father's will. The air in the room was heavy with the smell of old paper, stale coffee, and the unspoken tension that always accompanies the division of a life's labor. Beside her sat her older brother, Thomas, a young man who had long ago traded the dirt of the valley for the polished shoes and impatient rhythms of the city. He drummed his fingers on the mahogany table, his mind already calculating margins and liquidations. The lawyer, a tired man with spectacles resting low on his nose, read the final decree. The bulk of the estate was modest, a few $1,000s and a rusted pickup truck, but the primary asset was a 70-acre tract of land at the bottom of the valley. It was not prime agricultural soil. It was a wetland. To the local farmers, to the real estate brokers, and especially to Thomas, those 70 acres were a waterlogged liability, a mosquito-infested expanse of mud and reeds that swallowed tractors and produced absolutely nothing of value. Thomas did not even wait for the lawyer to finish folding the document before he spoke. His voice was sharp, carrying the arrogant certainty of a man who believed that formal education had granted him a monopoly on common sense. He declared that they needed to list the property immediately. He had already spoken to a developer from Portland who was willing to buy the swamp for pennies on the dollar, drain it, and fill it with gravel for a low-income housing project. It was a miserable offer, an insult to the land, but Thomas argued that any money pulled from that useless bog was a victory. The lawyer nodded in agreement, closing his briefcase with a snap that sounded like a gavel. The men in that room, and the men gathered in the diners and feed stores across the county, had been trading land since before Nora was a thought. They believed they knew exactly what they were looking at. They saw standing water. They saw ruin. They saw a problem to be solved by quick money and heavy machinery. Nora did not speak right away. She was a quiet woman, possessing a stillness that unnerved people who were used to constant noise. Where Thomas was a storm of ambition and quick fixes, Nora was a deep, slow-moving current. She looked at the legal document on the table, then looked at her brother's flushed, eager face. She remembered the way her father had walked that land. She remembered the hours he spent standing at the edge of the reeds in the pouring rain, watching the surface of the water, measuring something only he could see. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of iron. She refused to sell. She told Thomas that the land was not a liability, and she would not allow it to be drained and buried under asphalt. The reaction was immediate and entirely predictable. Thomas laughed, a harsh, barking sound that filled the small office. He asked her what she planned to do with 70 acres of mud, whether she intended to farm mosquitoes or harvest cattails. The lawyer offered a patronizing smile, leaning forward to gently explain the financial burden of property taxes on undeveloped, non-arable land. He spoke to her as if she were a child who had misunderstood a simple arithmetic problem. But Nora simply folded her hands in her lap and repeated her refusal. By the terms of the will, the land was left to them jointly, but it could not be sold without mutual consent. Thomas was furious. He stood up, knocking his chair back against the wall, and told her that she was trapping them both in a watery grave. He promised her that when she was bankrupt and begging for a bailout, he would not be there to save her. He stormed out of the office, leaving Nora alone with the lawyer, the document, and the immense weight of the inheritance. Let me tell you about the man who left them that land. Nora's father, Silas Calloway, was not a conventional farmer. He was a man of the old world, a man who believed that the earth spoke in a language that required years of silent listening to comprehend. He had bought that wetland decades ago, much to the amusement of his neighbors. While other men cleared timber and planted wheat on the high ground, Silas spent his days down in the bottomlands. He wore heavy rubber boots and carried a long wooden staff, walking the property in a methodical grid. He never attempted to drain it. He never cursed the water. To the outside world, he was an eccentric failure, a man who had wasted his life standing in a swamp. But Nora knew different. She had been his shadow since she was old enough to walk. She had followed him into the reeds, learning to step where the ground was firm, learning to read the ripples on the surface of the pools. The secret of the Calloway wetland was not something you could see from the county highway. You had to get down into the mud to understand it. After the lawyer's office, Nora returned to the small, drafty farmhouse that sat on the edge of the property. She went into her father's study, a room smelling of pipe tobacco and old leather. From the bottom drawer of his heavy oak desk, she pulled out a thick, weathered journal. The pages were brittle, filled with Silas's cramped, meticulous handwriting. This was the true inheritance. For 30 years, Silas had not just been walking the wetland, he had been studying it. The journal contained thousands of entries documenting the exact flow rates of the water, the seasonal temperature fluctuations, the mineral content of the soil, and the specific patterns of the natural springs that fed the bog. Now, let me explain what Silas had discovered and what Nora now held in her hands. The wetland was not stagnant. It appeared still on the surface, but beneath the reeds, it was a dynamic, living system. A massive artesian spring pushed cold, oxygen-rich water up through a layer of limestone bedrock, creating a slow, invisible river that moved continuously across the 70 acres before draining into a local creek. The water was naturally filtered by the limestone and the deep beds of peat. It was consistently cold, impeccably clean, and naturally aerated. Silas had mapped the entire subterranean flow. He had calculated the volume of water moving through the property every hour. The conventional wisdom of the county saw a flooded disaster. Silas's journal proved that the land was, in fact, a perfect, naturally engineered biological engine. It was an environment flawlessly suited for aquaculture. It was designed by nature for fish. Nora spent the next 3 weeks reading and rereading the journal until she had memorized every topographical contour and water temperature metric. She did not possess a degree in marine biology or agricultural economics. She possessed something far more powerful, generational knowledge acquired through patience and observation. She formulated a plan. She would not fight the water, as Thomas and the developers wished to do. She would harness it. She would use the natural gradient of the land to section the wetland into a series of tiered ponds. The artesian spring would feed the highest pond, and gravity would carry the water down through a system of weirs and gravel filters into the subsequent ponds, before finally releasing it back into the natural creek. It was a design of profound elegance, requiring no electrical pumps, no massive filtration machines, and minimal disruption to the existing ecosystem. The execution of this plan, however, required labor of a magnitude that would have broken most people. Nora had very little capital. She took the few $1,000s from the estate and bought a rusted, second-hand diesel excavator. She spent her days entirely alone, covered in black mud, learning to operate the heavy machinery through trial and error. The neighbors would drive by on the county road, slowing their trucks to watch the young woman wrestling with the old machine in the driving rain. The murmurs began immediately. At the local diner, over plates of eggs and black coffee, the established farmers shook their heads. They called it Calloway's folly. They said she had inherited her father's madness, along with his worthless dirt. They predicted she would sink the excavator in the mud, run out of money by winter, and come crawling to her brother to sell the land for whatever pennies she could scrape together. Thomas made sure to amplify these whispers. He visited the property once during that first year. He stood on the dry edge of the highway, wearing a tailored suit, refusing to step into the mud. He shouted over the roar of the diesel engine, mocking her efforts. He pointed at the massive trenches she was digging, laughing at the sheer absurdity of a young woman trying to reshape a swamp by herself. He told her that she was throwing away her life, that she was a fool clinging to the delusions of a dead man. Nora did not shut off the engine. She did not shout back. She simply looked at him from the cab of the excavator, her face smeared with grease and soil, and then pulled the levers to swing the massive bucket back into the earth. She let the work speak. She knew that arguing with a fool only proves there are two. The physical toll of that first year was staggering. Nora's hands became calloused and permanently stained with the dark peat. Her back ached with a deep, structural pain that never truly faded. She lived on a diet of canned soup and stale bread, pouring every available cent into diesel fuel, reinforced concrete for the weirs, and crushed river stone for the filtration beds. There were days when the rain was so heavy that the trenches collapsed, burying weeks of work in a matter of minutes. There were days when the old excavator broke down, forcing her to spend hours in the freezing mud, wrestling with heavy wrenches and grease guns to repair blown hydraulic lines. But she never stopped. Every time a trench collapsed, she remembered her father's quiet persistence. She rebuilt the walls. She reinforced the banks. She trusted the journal. By the spring of 1973, the transformation was complete. The chaotic, overgrown wetland had been sculpted into a series of 6 massive terraced ponds. The banks were stabilized with native grasses. The water from the artesian spring flowed perfectly into the upper basin, spilling over the concrete weirs with a continuous, rhythmic sound that was like music to Nora's ears. The water was crystal clear, revealing the clean gravel beds at the bottom. She tested the temperature and the oxygen levels. They matched her father's calculations flawlessly. The environment was ready. Now she had to bet everything she had left. She went to a regional hatchery and spent her last dollar on thousands of fingerlings, rainbow trout for the upper, colder ponds, and channel catfish for the lower, slightly warmer basins. Introducing the fish was a moment of profound, terrifying commitment. Once they were in the water, there was no turning back. She watched the tiny silver flashes disappear into the depths of the ponds, realizing that her survival now depended entirely on her ability to keep them alive. The subsequent years were a masterclass in patience and relentless discipline. Fish farming, contrary to what the uninitiated might think, is not a matter of simply throwing feed into a pond and waiting. It requires constant, vigilant management. Nora patrolled the banks every single day, from the freezing dawns of January to the sweltering afternoons of August. She learned to read the behavior of the fish. She could tell by the way the trout struck the surface if the oxygen levels were dipping. She could tell by the color of the water if an algae bloom was threatening to suffocate the lower ponds. The community continued to watch, and their skepticism evolved into a kind of morbid curiosity. They waited for the inevitable disaster. They waited for a disease to wipe out her stock. They waited for a winter freeze to kill the operation. And there were close calls. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever stood alone in the dark, watching your entire livelihood teeter on the edge of ruin, with no one to call for help? That was Nora's reality during the brutal winter of 1974. A freak cold snap sent temperatures plummeting to record lows. The surface of the ponds began to freeze solid, a situation that would trap toxic gases beneath the ice and suffocate the entire harvest. Nora did not sleep for 3 days. She walked the perimeters of the ponds with a heavy steel sledgehammer, breaking the ice by hand. When the hammer became too heavy, she used an axe. When her arms lost all feeling, she used a long wooden pole, the very same staff her father had used to walk the property. The wind howled across the valley, cutting through her heavy coat, freezing the spray of water onto her face and eyelashes. She was exhausted, terrified, and entirely alone. In the darkest hour of the second night, she dropped the sledgehammer onto the ice and fell to her knees. The cold was agonizing. The urge to simply lie down in the snow and let the winter win was overwhelming. It was the moment of absolute private doubt. She thought of Thomas, warm in his city apartment. She thought of the mocking faces at the diner. She wondered if they were right. She wondered if she was just a foolish girl playing in the mud. But as she knelt there on the frozen bank, she looked down at the water beneath the jagged hole she had just chopped. In the beam of her flashlight, she saw a massive rainbow trout, a fish that had grown to nearly 2 pounds, glide slowly past the opening. Its colors were vibrant, its movements strong and healthy. The water from the artesian spring, rising from deep within the earth, was keeping the bottom layers of the pond warm enough for the fish to survive. The system was working. Her father's calculations were correct. The earth was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Nora picked up the sledgehammer. She stood up, her muscles screaming in protest, and she went back to work. She broke the ice until the sun came up, and she broke it again the next night. She lost less than 1% of her stock that winter. When the spring finally arrived, the ponds were teeming with life. The fish had grown rapidly, feeding on the high-quality diet Nora provided and thriving in the pristine, constantly moving water. It was time for the first harvest. Nora did not go to the large, industrial distributors. She knew her product was superior, and she knew she had to build her reputation from the ground up. She netted 50 pounds of trout, packed them in ice in the bed of her father's rusted pickup, and drove to the finest restaurant in the nearest city. She walked through the back alley, bypassing the front door, and knocked directly on the kitchen entrance. The head chef was a temperamental man who was used to dealing with large commercial suppliers. He took one look at Nora, with her mud-stained boots and rough hands, and nearly turned her away. But Nora calmly lifted the lid of the cooler. The chef stopped. He picked up one of the trout. He examined the clarity of its eyes, the firmness of its flesh, the vibrant, natural coloration of its scales. He recognized immediately that this was not a factory-farmed fish raised in a stagnant, crowded tank. This was a creature that had grown in clean, cold, moving water. He bought the entire cooler on the spot and demanded to know how much more she could supply. That single transaction was the pebble that started the avalanche. The chef served the trout that evening, and the response was extraordinary. Word spread quickly through the culinary community. By the end of the month, Nora was receiving phone calls from other high-end restaurants in Portland and Seattle. They were all looking for the same thing: premium, naturally raised fish that tasted of pure mountain water rather than mud and commercial feed. Nora's meticulous management of the water flow, her refusal to overcrowd the ponds, and her dedication to the health of the ecosystem had produced a product that the market had not even realized it was missing. The subsequent decade was a period of slow, deliberate, and explosive growth. Nora did not take out massive bank loans to expand recklessly. She reinvested every dollar of profit back into the fishery. She upgraded the weirs. She built a proper, temperature-controlled processing facility on the property. She hired a small, dedicated crew of local workers, paying them fair wages and teaching them her father's philosophy of water management. The community's whispers of mockery slowly faded, replaced first by confusion, then by a grudging respect, and finally by outright awe. The same men who had laughed at her in the diner now watched refrigerated trucks bearing the logo Calloway Springs Fishery rolling down the county highway every single day. By 1985, the operation was a regional powerhouse. Nora was supplying not just restaurants, but premium seafood distributors across the Pacific Northwest. The catfish in the lower ponds had become just as famous as the trout, prized for their clean flavor and firm texture. The 70 acres of worthless swamp was now a highly calibrated, immensely profitable agricultural engine. An independent appraiser, brought in for insurance purposes, evaluated the land, the infrastructure, and the standing inventory of fish. The final valuation was staggering. The property that Thomas had wanted to sell for a few $1,000s was now a fully operational, debt-free enterprise valued at over $500,000. In the agricultural economy of the mid-'80s, this was a monumental fortune. It was shortly after this valuation became public knowledge that Thomas returned. He did not drive up in a luxury sedan this time. He arrived in a mid-range, slightly battered car, wearing a suit that was a few years out of style. The intervening years had not been kind to him. His aggressive investments in urban real estate had collapsed during a recession, leaving him highly leveraged and desperate for capital. He drove slowly down the newly paved driveway of the Fishery, his eyes wide as he took in the scale of the operation. He saw the pristine ponds, the active processing facility, the trucks being loaded with premium product. He saw the physical manifestation of patience and ancestral wisdom, a stark contrast to his own life of frantic, hollow speculation. Nora was standing by the upper weir, holding the wooden staff her father had used, watching the water flow over the concrete. She saw Thomas approach. She did not walk to meet him. She let him navigate the gravel path, forcing him to come to her on the land he had once despised. Thomas stopped a few feet away. The arrogance that had defined his youth was completely gone, replaced by a nervous, twitching energy. He looked at the water, then looked at his sister. He tried to force a smile, trying to summon the old dynamic of the older brother addressing the foolish younger sister, but the reality of the $500,000 empire surrounding them made the attempt pathetic. He started to speak, his voice lacking its usual sharp edge. He talked about family, about blood being thicker than water. He talked about how proud their father would be of what they had accomplished. He finally got to the point, suggesting that since he was still technically a half-owner of the original deed, it was time for him to step in and help manage the business. He talked about expansion, about taking the company public, about leveraging the equity to buy more land. He was still the same man, still looking for the quick extraction of wealth, still completely blind to the actual nature of the work. Nora listened to him in absolute silence. She let him talk until he ran out of words, until the only sound between them was the rushing of the artesian spring over the weir. She looked at him, her face weathered by years of sun and freezing rain, her eyes possessing the same deep, slow-moving current they always had. She did not yell. She did not express anger or vindictiveness. She simply stated a fact. She told him that he did not own half of the Fishery. She reminded him that while the original deed was joint, she had kept meticulous records of every cent she had invested, every hour of labor she had performed, and every tax bill she had paid single-handedly for 14 years. She told him that she had already had her lawyer draft a new agreement. She was offering to buy his half of the original, undeveloped land value, adjusted for inflation, which amounted to a paltry sum compared to the empire she had built. Thomas's face flushed red. The old anger flared for a moment, and he threatened to take her to court to sue her for half of the business. But Nora stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Her presence was commanding, forged by years of breaking ice and moving earth. She looked him dead in the eye and spoke with a quiet, terrifying authority. She told him that if he took her to court, she would bury him in legal fees for a decade. She told him that no judge in the county, knowing the history of the land and witnessing her solitary labor, would ever grant him a single fish from those ponds. She held out a manila envelope containing the buyout contract and a pen. This was the moment of absolute truth. Thomas looked into his sister's eyes and saw the immovable reality of her will. He looked at the massive, thriving ponds, the testament to a knowledge he had mocked and a discipline he did not possess. The fight drained out of him entirely. His shoulders slumped. He reached out with a trembling hand and took the envelope. As he signed the document against the hood of his car, he paused. He looked back at Nora, his voice cracking slightly. He finally asked the question that had been haunting him since he first saw the trucks on the highway. He asked, "How did you know? How did you know it wasn't just a swamp?" Nora took the signed contract from his hand. She looked out over the water, watching a massive trout break the surface to catch an insect, sending perfectly concentric ripples out. She gave him a simple, humble answer. She said, "I didn't just look at the mud, Thomas. I read Father's journal. I listened to the water. You wanted to sell the land because you thought it was broken. I kept the land because I knew it was perfectly made. You just lacked the patience to understand it." Thomas had no reply. He nodded slowly, a profound acknowledgement of his own foolishness and her undeniable mastery. He got into his car and drove away, leaving Nora as the sole, undisputed owner of the Calloway Springs fishery. The narrative of Nora Calloway does not end with that victory. The true measure of a life's work is found in its endurance over the decades. The subsequent 30 years were a testament to the stability and sustainability of her methods. While other fish farms in the region rose and fell, victims of overexpansion, disease outbreaks caused by overcrowding, or crippling debt from heavy machinery loans, Calloway Springs remained a constant, thriving entity. Nora never deviated from her father's original calculations. She never pushed the ponds beyond their natural carrying capacity. She understood that greed was the enemy of longevity. As Nora aged, she became a respected elder in the agricultural community of the Oregon Valley. The same farmers who had once mocked her from the diner booths now came to her for advice on water rights, soil management, and sustainable practices. She was invited to speak at agricultural colleges, though she rarely accepted. She preferred the quiet rhythm of the fishery, the smell of the cold water, and the daily patrol of the banks. Her hands, though knotted with arthritis, still retained the deep strength forged during those early years in the mud. She walked the property with a wooden staff, much like her father had, a solitary figure commanding immense respect. Eventually, the time came to pass the torch. Nora never married, having dedicated her life entirely to the land, but she had taken in a nephew, the son of a distant cousin, who showed the same quiet, observant nature she had possessed in her youth. His name was David. From the time he was a young boy, Nora taught him not just the mechanics of the fishery, but the philosophy behind it. She did not teach him how to maximize profit margins. She taught him how to read the water. She taught him how to diagnose the health of a pond by the smell of the morning mist. She taught him that the land does not belong to the farmer belongs to the land. When Nora was in her late 70s, she formally transferred the day-to-day operations to David. On the day the paperwork was signed, she did not give him a speech about corporate strategy or market expansion. She took him into the old farmhouse, into the same study that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. She opened the bottom drawer of the heavy oak desk and handed him the weathered, leather-bound journal written by Silas Calloway. She told David that the true value of the fishery was not in the bank accounts or the processing facility. The true value was in the knowledge contained within those fragile pages, the ancestral wisdom that understood the natural order of things. Nora Calloway lived out her final years in the farmhouse, watching from the porch as a new generation tended the water she had harnessed. She had taken a piece of land that the world deemed entirely worthless, a liability to be drained and destroyed, and through sheer patience, back-breaking labor, and an unwavering belief in esoteric, inherited knowledge, she had transformed it into an enduring legacy. She had faced the arrogant, generalized wisdom of the establishment and proven it catastrophically wrong. The story of the Calloway Wetland is a parable for anyone who has ever been told that their vision is foolish, that their methods are too slow, or that their inheritance is a burden. The experts, the bankers, and her own brother looked at the standing water and saw only a problem to be eradicated by force and debt. They believed that value could only be created by destroying what was natural and imposing something artificial. Nora Calloway succeeded because she understood a fundamental truth that the modern world often forgets. The brothers said to sell the wetland because it was broken. She kept the wetland, and the land remembered how to provide.